Welcome to Café Stories. I'm your host Alie today. We're stepping into the elegant world of fine dining and detective work with Nero Wolfe in the curious affair of the Chef's Challenge. Before we begin, drop a comment letting me know where you're listening. From today, I love reading your comments. Are you familiar with Stout's iconic detective grab your favorite beverage? Perhaps a glass of beer, like Wolfe himself enjoyed his. Stay curious, and let's get started. Nero Wolfe and the curious affair of the Chef's. Chapter 1, An Unusual Proposition Challenge. Chapter 1, An Unusual Proposition. It was a Tuesday in April. One of those perfect New York spring days that make you forgive the city for its winter. And Nero Wolfe was in the plant rooms with Theodore. When the mail arrived, I sorted through it at my desk, SE operating the bills, the checks, the personal correspondence, and the circulars. Among them was a heavy cream-colored envelope with an embossed gold logo that caught my eye, the kind of stationer that costs more than most people's weekly grocery bill. I placed it in the center of Wolfe's desk, where it sat waiting for the Ford descent from the plant rooms at precisely 6:02, after Wolfe had spent 2 hours with his orchids, consumed a liter of beer, and caught up on the day's business. He picked it up, examined the envelope with mild curiosity, and sliced it open with his gold letter opener. As she read, his eyebrows went up a 1/16 of an inch, significant for him. He passed it across to me without comment. Confound it, I said after reading. Does this man think you're for rent? He proposes a business arrangement, not a rental agreement, Wolfe replied, leaning back in his custom chair. Though I admit the presumption is considerable. The letter was from Jerome Blaine, whose name I recognized from restaurant reviews and business pages. He'd proposed hosting something called the 5 Masters Challenge in our Brownstone, specifically using our dining room and kitchen for a prestigious cooking competition. The fee he offered made my eyebrows go up considerably, more than a 1/16 of an inch. You not seriously considering this? I said, though I could see from his expression that he was. It warrants discussion with Fritz Atta. Minimum. Wolfe picked up his current book, a biography of Alexandre Dumas, that focused heavily on his culinary exploits, but didn't open it, which told me his mind was working. Fritz appeared at the office doorway precisely at 6:15 to announce dinner would be ready in 15 minutes. Wolfe beckoned him in and handed him the letter. Fritz read it carefully, his normally impassive face showing definite discomfort. This man Blaine has invited me to participate as well, sir. And will you? Wolfe asked. No, sir. I have no interest in such publicity. Fritz's lips tightened. And if I may speak frankly, Mr. Blaine has a certain reputation in culinary circles. Wolfe's eyes sharpened. What nature of reputation? He is known to be acquisitive, sir. Many chefs are protective of their recipes. Mr. Blaine is known to be interested in other people's recipes for his own purposes. Interesting, Wolfe murmured. And these participating chefs, you know of them by reputation? Yes. All are highly regarded. Fritz hesitated. I know Anton Visa personal. We trained under the same chef in Switzerland many years ago. I see. What of the others? Miss Hayes is famous for her family recipes going back generations. Miss Chen is very innovative, combining techniques in new ways. And Mr. Gomez has a small restaurant that people travel great distances to visit. I interrupted. This is all very educational, but surely you're not considering turning the Brownstone into a cooking show? Set Wolfe ignored me, which is one of his specialties. Fritz, would you object to this event occurring in your kitchen, provided you maintain supervision? Fritz considered. If you wish it, sir, I would manage, though I would require certain conditions. He said it like a man agreeing to a necessary dental procedure. Thank you, Fritz, we'll discuss those conditions should I decide to accept. Dinner in 15 minutes, you said. After Fritz left, I turned to Wolfe. Are you serious? The disruption alone would be. Archie. Wolfe cut me off. Please call Mr. Saul Panzer and ask him to come tomorrow at 11. And after dinner, I would like you to gather information on Mr. Jerome Blaine and each of these chefs. You're taking the case before there even is a case. I objected. Wolfe picked up his book and opened it. Perhaps I'm preventing, during dinner, a court that would have made angels weep. I asked Fritz more about Blaine. There are rumors, Fritz said, carefully choosing his words, that he obtains family recipes through methods that are not entirely ethical. Sometimes he buys them, but sometimes he shrugged expressively. He steals them, I prompted. There have been incidents where staff suddenly appear in a restaurant, learn the special recipes, then disappear to work for Mr. Blaine. Soon after, similar dishes appear in his restaurants. Wolfe, who had been focusing primarily on the cassoulet, looked up. Do you know why these specific chefs were selected for his competition? Fritz nodded. I believe there may be connections. Anton once wrote a very bad review of Blaine's first restaurant. Miss Hayes has family recipes. Blaine hasted to buy many times. Miss Chen refused to. Work for him, I understand. And Mr. Gomez's restaurant is in a location Blaine wants for expansion. Wolfe nodded, apparently satisfied with this confirmation of whatever theory he was developing. The next morning, I spent several hours researching our potential client and the chefs. By the time Saul Panzer arrived, I had compiled a respectable dossier on each. Wolfe spent 40 minutes, with S giving him instructions I wasn't privy to after Saul left. Wolfe dictated a response to Blaine accepting his proposal, but with several conditions, including Fritz's complete authority over the kitchen equipment and facilities. You're really going through with this? I asked after typing the letter. We don't need the money, and you hate disruptions to your schedule. I find Mr. Blaine's proposal intriguing, Archie, for reasons that should become evident. Fine, keep your secrets, I said. But turning this place into a 3-ring culinary circus seems extreme. Even for you, I expect it will be educational, Wolfe replied, and then turned his attention to the orchid catalog that had arrived that morning, effectively ending the conversation when I returned from mailing Wolfe's response to Blaine. There was already a message waiting from him, enthusiastically accepting all conditions, and requesting to send his assistant Veronica Watts the following day to begin preparations. I hope you know what you're doing, I told Wolfe when I relayed the message. I usually do. Archie, he replied, not looking up from his catalog. Usually do Chapter 2 preparations and Chapter 2 preparations and precautions. Veronica Watts arrived at the Brownstone at precisely 10 a.m. The next day, she was somewhere in her early 30s, with sharp features, dark hair pulled into a tight ponytail, and a clipboard that she wielded like a medieval weapon. Her handshake was brief and firm, and her eyes swept the hallway with such calculating precision that I half expected her to pull out a tape measure then and there. Mr. Blaine is extremely excited about this arrangement, she said, extending a business card that was as stiff and formal as she was. I'm here to ensure everything goes smoothly. I'll give you the tour, I said, but there are boundaries. Mr. Wolfe has specific requirements. That got me a smile that never reached her eyes. Mr. Blaine mentioned, I understand the significance of this location. Significance. I raised an eyebrow. A fortress. Gastronomic tradition, she said, her tone suggesting she was quoting someone. Blaine, I assumed. May I see the kitchen first? Fritz was waiting in the kitchen, standing with military attention beside his spotless counters. If he'd been guarding the crown jewels, he couldn't have looked more vigilant. This is where the magic happens, I said, gesturing around, and Fritz is the magician. Fritz nodded curtly at Ms. Watts. Madam. This is impressive, she said, and for the first time, genuine appreciation crossed her face. She ran a finger along one of the countertops, examined the French copper pots hanging above the stove, and paused at the door of Fritz's pantry. Is that where you keep your spices? She asked, a bit too casually. Among other things, Fritz answered, without moving from his position. I'll need to document everything for setup purposes, she said, pulling a small digital camera from her bag. Mr. Blaine wants to be sure we position everything correctly for the competitors. No photographs of Mr. Wolfe's private areas, I said firmly. The kitchen, dining room, and front room are all you need to concern yourself with. Her eyebrow twitched slightly. Of course. Professional courtesy. She spent the next hour photographing the kitchen from every angle, asking questions about electrical outlets, measuring counter spaces, and making notes that seemed excessive for a cooking competition. I noticed her particular interest in Fritz's organization system, the contents of various cabinets, and especially his personal cookbook shelf. When she asked to see the dining room, I led her through. Wolfe was in his office pretending to read, but undoubtedly listening to every word he had refused to meet her claiming. His schedule wouldn't permit it. The dining room will be perfect, she said, snapping more photos. We'll need to rearrange. Of course, rearrange for the cameras and judge's table. I don't recall any mention of cameras in Mr. Blaine's proposal. I said just for documentation, she replied smoothly. Not broadcast, we want to record the historic event. I made a mental note to have this clarified. With Blaine directly, Wolfe wouldn't appreciate becoming accidental entertainment. While in the dining room, Watts walked to the window and studied the lock mechanism with what seemed more than casual interest. Security concerns, I asked pointedly. She turned with a practiced smile. Just being thorough. There will be some valuable equipment brought in when I brought her. Back to the front room, she pulled out a document from her clipboard. These are the specifics Mr. Blaine wants to confirm. Equipment deliveries, competitor requirements, schedule details. I glanced over it. I'll need to review this with Mr. Wolfe, of course. She said, then paused. Mr. Goodwin's. It's true that Fritz Brenner has created private recipes for Mr. Wolfe that have never been published. The question seemed innocent enough, but something in her tone raised my hackles. Fritz creates many dishes. What Mr. Wolfe enjoys at his table is private. She smiled professional curiosity. The culinary world has legends about some of those creations. After she left, I went straight to Wolfe's office. He was in his chair, fingers laced over his substantial middle sheaths. More interested in Fritz's kitchen than the competition, I said, without preamble. Indeed, Wolfe's eyes were half closed. Your impressions either she's the most thorough event planner in New York, or she's casing the joint. She was particularly interested in the window locks and Fritz's recipe collection. Wolfe nodded as expected. Please call Fritz in when Fritz arrived. Wolfe asked, was anything disturbed while you were out of the kitchen? Fritz's expression tightened. Yes, sir. I was showing her the stove specifications, and when I returned to my spice cabinet, the arrangement had been altered, nothing missing but examined. What specifically? Wolfe asked. My private collection of imported spices, and Fritz hesitated. My personal notebook was moved slightly. With the recipes I have created for you. Wolfe's lips compressed to a thin line. Satisfactory. That evening, as I was finishing typing up my notes on the day's events, the phone rang. The voice on the other end was female, tense and unfamiliar. Is this Mr. Goodwin? My name is Marion Hayes. I'm one of the chefs for the competition. What can I do for you, Miss Hayes? Someone broke into my apartment today. Her voice was controlled but strained. Nothing valuable was taken but my grandmother's recipe. Journals were disturbed. I thought you should know since Mr. Wolfe is hosting the event. How did you get this number? I asked, because it wasn't the sort of thing you'd find easily. Anton Visser gave it to me. He said if there was trouble, you people would want to know. Was anything taken? I asked. No, but she paused. The journals were carefully put back, but in the wrong order. Someone went through them, page by page. This isn't the first time Mr. Blaine has shown interest in my family recipes, but breaking. And have you called the police? What would I say? Nothing was stolen. She sighed. I just thought Mr. Wolfe should know what kind of man he's dealing with. I assured her we'd look into it, then reported the conversation to Wolfe, who was in the middle of his evening beer, it would appear. Wolfe said, setting down his glass, that Mr. Blaine's interests extend beyond a simple cooking competition. You knew that from the beginning, I accused. That's why you took this case, not a case yet. Archie, Wolfe corrected merely. In anticipation, so we're continuing with this circus indeed, but perhaps we should implement some additional security measures of our own. He picked up his beer again. Call Saul in the morning. I believe we need to accelerate our inquiries. And what do I tell Fritz about his kitchen being invaded? Tell him, Wolfe said with unusual steel in his voice, that his domain will be protected. And Archie, he added, as I turned to leave, check his spice cabinet personally. Tomorrow I want to know exactly what Ms. Watts found so interesting. Chapter 3. The competition begins. Chapter 3. The competition begins. The morning of the competition arrived with the kind of controlled chaos that makes me question my career choices. By 7 a.m., a small army of workers had invaded the Brownstone. transforming our dignified dining room into something between a television studio and a battlefield, lights on stands, portable cooking stations, and enough electrical equipment to short-circuit. Half of Manhattan had been hauled in, under the supervision of a harried production manager, who kept consulting a clipboard that looked suspiciously like the one Ms. Watts had wielded days earlier. Wolfe naturally had locked himself in his bedroom, till his normal 9:00 a.m. Monsieur descended to the plant rooms, refusing to witness the desecration of his sanctuary. Fritz hovered near his kitchen, a marred expression on his face, as strangers arranged equipment on his counters. "They're using my knives," he muttered to me, watching a young man unroll a canvas knife case atop his cutting board. "I would not permit this for anyone but Mr. Wolfe." "I know," I said, patting his shoulder. "It'll be over soon. Not soon enough." He straightened his already immaculate apron. "Mr. Goodwin, I've placed certain items in the safe, as Mr. Wolfe suggested." The safe he referred to was the one in Wolfe's office, where we kept important documents and occasionally items pertinent to cases. That Fritz's recipe collection now resided there told me how seriously Wolfe was taking this little culinary espionage game. Jerome Blaine arrived at 9:30, bringing with him the atmosphere of someone accustomed to making grand entrances. He was tall, with the kind of polished good looks that come from expensive barbers, and tailor rather than genetic, and a smile that showed too many teeth to be genuine. He extended his hand as if granting me a favor. "Mr. Goodwin, a pleasure. This arrangement is working out splendidly." His voice had the practiced cadence of someone who'd spent time in broadcasting. "Where is the great man himself?" "Mr. Wolfe adheres to a strict schedule," I said, not adding that Wolfe had specifically timed his movements to avoid meeting Blaine before necessary. "He'll join us at the appointed time, of course." Blaine's gaze swept the room with the calculating look of a general surveying conquered territory. "Did Veronica provide you with the final schedule?" "The first round begins at 11. We have the judges arriving at 10:30 for orientation, all arranged." I said, though. "You notice there are rather more cameras than your proposal suggested." He waved a dismissive hand. "Just documentation. This is a historic event. After all, the first cooking competition held in Nero Wolfe's famous Brownstone, the culinary world. We'll be fascinated by 10 car. The chefs began arriving, each with an assistant in tow. I'd researched them thoroughly, but seeing them in person added dimensions my reports had missed. Anton Visser arrived first, a tall, cadaverous man with the intensity of a surgeon and hands that never stopped moving. He nodded curtly to Fritz, a professional acknowledgement that seemed to hold years of shared history. There was something Germanic in his precision as he examined his assigned station, testing each appliance. Methodically, Sophia Chen arrived next, their compact frame and calm demeanor, belling the fierce reputation she'd earned in San Francisco's competitive restaurant scene. Unlike Visor, who moved with severe economy, Chen had a fluid grace, her hands dancing over her workspace as if conducting an orchestra. Only she could hear. Eduardo Gomez came in with his assistant, a young man who looked enough like him to be his son. Gomez had the weathered look of someone who'd worked in kitchens since childhood. With burn scars on his forearms and calloused hands, he exchanged rapid-fire Spanish with his assistant, pointing to various aspects of the kitchen setup with obvious concern. Marion Hayes was the last to arrive 15 minutes before the competition was scheduled to begin. She glanced my way with recognition, her phone call from the previous evening creating an unspoken connection. She was younger than I'd expected, perhaps early 30s, with the focused intensity I'd seen in professionals who'd fought their way up in male-dominated industries. Her assistant was older, a gray-haired woman who moved with a confident familiarity of someone who had worked alongside Hayes for years. Blaine gathered them all for a briefing. "Welcome to the first 5 Masters Challenge. You're about to compete in one of the most exclusive culinary venues in America. For the next 3 days, you'll prepare dishes that showcase your talents while facing challenges designed to test your adaptability and creativity." He gestured expansively. "Today's theme is Heritage Reimagined. You'll each prepare a dish that honors your culinary traditions, while incorporating a modern twist. The judges will score based on technique, creativity, and execution. the lowest scoring chef after today's round. We'll be eliminated. I watched their faces as Blaine explained the rules. Visa remained impassive. Chen nodded occasionally. Hayes maintained a professional smile that didn't reach her eyes, and Gomez frowned slightly, his fingers drumming against his. Leg at exactly 11. Wolfe made his entrance precisely as his schedule dictated. The room quieted as he moved to the judge's table, his substantial form commanding attention without effort. Blaine hurried over, hand extended. Mr. Wolfe, an honor to finally meet you. Wolfe inclined his head a fraction of an inch, ignoring the outstretched hand. Mr. Blaine, I trust the arrangements are satisfactory, more than satisfactory. Blaine gushed, recovering from the handshake rebuff. Your home is everything we hoped for indeed. Wolfe settled into the reinforced chair we positioned at the judge's table. Shall we proceed? The competition began with a flurry of activity. Each chef moved with practiced efficiency, their assistants anticipating needs before they were voiced. I stationed myself where I could observe both the cooking area and Wolfe, who was watching the proceedings with the focused attention he usually reserved for murder suspects. 40 minutes into the competition, I noticed Veronica Watts slipped from the dining room since Wolfe was occupied with judging and Fritz was monitoring his kitchen. I followed her. She moved with purpose toward the office, glancing back once before trying the doorknob, finding it locked. I had secured it earlier. She frowned and continued down the hallway, pausing at Fritz's pantry. Lost? I asked, stepping into view. She didn't startle, which told messing about her nerves, looking for the restroom, actually wrong direction. I said pleasantly, would you like me to show you? No need. Her smile was professionally bland. I'll find my way when I return to the competition. Wolfe caught my eye with a barely perceptible nod. I moved to his side, bending as if to check the judge's scoring sheets. M. Watts was exploring, I murmured, and Wolfe asked without looking up. Office and pantry said she was looking for the bathroom. F. Wolfe muttered, maintain vigilance. As the first round neared completion, I noticed Blaine circulating among the chefs, pausing longest at Marion Hayes' station. Under the guise of casual conversation, he was observing her technique as she prepared what looked like a traditional tart with some modern elements I couldn't identify. His interest seemed more focused on her preparation method than friendly conversation when Hayes stepped away briefly to retrieve something from her supply case. Blaine leaned over her workstation, eyes scanning the handwritten notes she had beside her cutting board. His hand moved slightly, and I couldn't tell if he had touched anything. The judging that followed was precise and formal, each sheet presented their creation with a brief explanation, and the panel, Wolfe, a food critic from The Times and a senior chef from one of the city's most established restaurants, evaluated without comment. Wolfe, true to form, tasted each dish with complete concentration. His eyes closed as if listening to music. Only he could. Here, after deliberations, Sophia Chen was declared the winner of the round, with Gomez placing second visor and Hayes tied for third, resulting in no elimination, a twist Blaine announced with theatrical flair as a special decision to maintain the competition's integrity as the chefs packed up their equipment for the day. I noticed Visser examining his knife case with a frown. He called his assistant over, and they exchanged heated whispers. Visser's face darkening as he checked each knife. I moved closer, pretending to clear some plates. Someone touched them. Visser was saying in accented English, the arrangement is different. His assistant shrugged, perhaps during cleaning. No, Visser cut him off. I know my tools. Someone has handled them. I filed this away to report to Wolfe along with my observations of Blaine's interest in Haz's station. As the room cleared, Wolfe remained seated, watching Blaine direct the cleanup with the satisfaction of a chess player whose opponent has made a predictable opening move when everyone had departed except the cleanup crew. I returned to Wolfe's side. Interesting day. I commented merely. Preliminary moves, Wolfe replied, rising from his chair with surprising agility for a man of his bulk. The substantive play has yet to begin. Visa claims. Someone went through his knife case. Wolfe nodded. Unsurprising, and Miss Hayes. Blaine was very interested in her station. Might have touched her notes when she stepped away as expected. Wolfe glanced around the room once more. Tomorrow will be more revealing. I think have Saul report at 9 tonight, you know. I said as we headed for the office someday, you might consider telling me what you're expecting to happen before it happens. Just as a novelty, that would deprive you of the satisfaction of discovery, Archie. Wolfe replied with what passed for humor. In his universe and me of the pleasure of your expressions when enlightenment. Chapter 4. Suspicious Movements. Dawn's Chapter 4. Suspicious Movements. Saul Panza arrived at 9 that evening looking as inconspicuous. As always, that was Saul's gift. He could blend into any background like a chameleon while missing nothing. His narrow face with its big nose wouldn't win any beauty contests, but the eyes beneath his bushy brows were among the sharpest in the business. Wolfe paid him double what he paid any other operative, and he was worth every penny. Satisfactory, Wolfe said, when I ushered Saul into the office beer. Saul, thanks. Saul Paul took his usual seat in the red leather chair, accepted the bottle I handed him, and waited while Wolfe settled his bulk into his custom chair. Your findings, Wolfe asked after taking a sip of his own beer. I've been looking into Blaine's operation like you asked. Saul's voice was soft but clear. There's a pattern over the last 3 years. Every time Blaine opens a new restaurant, he features signature dishes suspiciously similar to those from established chefs who've had some interaction with him. Specifics, Wolfe prompted. Last year, a pastry chef named Renata Diaz demonstrated a unique dessert. At a charity event Blaine attended 2 months later, a variation appeared on the menu at his new place in Soho. 6 months ago, he judged a competition where Eduardo Gomez prepared a special seafood dish. Now a similar recipe is featured at Blaise Restaurant. In Miami legal challenges, I asked Saul shook his head. Non-successful recipes are modified just enough to avoid copyright issues, and Blaine has expensive lawyers. Most chefs can't afford to fight him. And the subjects of our current interest, Wolfe asked Marion Hayes, has refused to sell her family recipe collection 3 times in the past 2 years. Blaine's offers kept increasing. Last one was 6 figures. Saul sipped his beer. Sophia Chen turned down an executive chef position at his flagship restaurant, which apparently offended him. Anton Visser's restaurant review nearly bankrupted Blaine's first place before he rebuilt his reputation. Motive established, Wolfe murmured. And Mr. Gomez, his restaurant occupies a corner location in a building Blaine's company recently purchased. The lease renewal comes up in 3 months. Wolfe nodded as if another piece of a puzzle had fallen into place. The break-in at Miss Hayes's apartment. No official police report, but I spoke with the building superintendent. Someone claiming to be from a maintenance company gained access that morning. Professional job, no damage to the door, and our Mr. Blaine's whereabouts that day. Business breakfast until 10. Then his calendar shows a 2-hour gap before his next appointment. Sufficient time. Wolfe noted. Anything else of interest? Blaine's publishing a cookbook next month. Signature Creations. Advanced promotional materials promise never before published recipes from America's culinary masters. Wolfe's eyebrows rose a fraction of an inch. Indeed, Archie. Did you observe any photography during today's competition beyond the documentary cameras? Blaine's assistant Watts had her phone out several times, seemingly taking notes. I said could have been shooting video. Possible, Wolfe agreed. Saul, I'd like you to continue your inquiries specifically. Obtain a copy of the manuscript for this forthcoming cookbook. Might take some doing. Saul said, do you have 3 days? I'll double your usual fee. Saul nodded, finished his beer, and left without further discussion. That's what I appreciated about Saul. No wasted words, just results. After he departed, I turned to Wolfe. So Blaine's running an elaborate scheme to steal recipes for his cookbook, it appears. So Wolfe said, though I suspect his ambitions extend beyond mere publication. You think he's after Fritz's recipes too, among others? Wolfe pressed, his lips together. We shall see. The next morning brought round 2 of the competition. The chefs arrived earlier, each looking more determined than the day before. Anton Visser entered with a new knife case clasped with a small padlock. His expression was grim. As he ranged his station with military precision, Wolfe had positioned himself at the judges' table before any of the competitors arrived claiming it. allowed better observation given that it also allowed him to remain seated throughout the proceedings. I suspected the dual benefit wasn't accidental. Blaine announced the day's challenge with theatrical flair. Today's theme transformation. You'll each receive a basket of identical common ingredients. Your task is to elevate these ordinary components into an extraordinary creation. The ingredients were revealed: chicken thighs, root vegetables, lemons, and a few basic staples, nothing remarkable, which I gathered was the point. The chefs would need to rely on technique and creativity rather than exotic components. As the competition began, I noticed Chen's assistant placing a small notebook beside her station. When Chen opened it, I caught a glimpse of handwritten notes with diagrams, presumably recipes or techniques. Blaine noticed too, his eyes lingering on the notebook longer than casual interest would warrant. Halfway through the allotted cooking time, Visa stepped away from his station to retrieve something from his supplies. In that brief moment, Veronica Watts passed close to his workstation, ostensibly checking something with the production team positioned nearby. Her movement wasn't suspicious in itself, but the slight pause as she passed his cutting board registered on my internal alarm. I shifted position for a better view and saw Watts's phone in her hand angled down toward Visa's workspace. When Visser returned seconds later, she was already moving away, typing something on her phone. I caught Wolfe's eye and gave a slight nod toward Watts. His nearly imperceptible eyebrow raise told me he'd registered my meaning. The tension among the chefs was more noticeable today. Gomez worked with fierce concentration, barely speaking. Even to his assistant, Hayes kept glancing toward Blah and Watts, her movements more guarded than the previous day. Visa had positioned himself to block most of his preparation. From easy viewing, Chen alone seemed oblivious to the undercurrents, working with the same fluid grace as before. Though I noticed, she kept her notebook closed when not directly consulting it. When the cooking ended and judging began, Wolfe tasted each creation with his usual thoroughness. After the panel's deliberation, Blaine announced that Visa had won the round with Hayes in second place. Chen and Gomez tied for last. Normally this would mean an elimination, Blaine said, his perfect smile flashing. But I've decided that for the final round tomorrow, all 4 chefs will compete. The stakes will be higher. The overall winner takes home not just the trophy but a feature spread in Culinary Master magazine. The announcement produced polite applause, but I noticed the competitors exchanging glances. This wasn't how the competition had been described to them originally. As the chefs began cleaning their stations, Gomez approached Visa. They spoke quietly, heads bent together with occasional glances toward Blaine. When Chen and Hayes joined them, I moved closer under the pretense of collecting score sheets. Not what I agreed to, Visser was saying. This is not a proper competition. I know, Hayes replied quietly. Something doesn't feel right. Gomez nodded. My knives were moved yesterday. Someone examined them. You too? Chen looked surprised. I thought it was just my station. Their conversation ended abruptly as Blaine approached planning strategy for tomorrow. He asked jovially, "It will be our most exciting challenge. Yet what exactly will this final challenge entail?" Hayes asked, her tone professionally neutral. That would spoil the surprise. Blaine's smile widened. But I can tell you it will showcase your most distinctive talents. After they dispersed, I reported the conversation to Wolfe, who had remained at the judges' table watching the room like a large sedentary. Suspicions grow, he commented. Good. That may prove useful. Watts was photographing Visa's preparation techniques. I added, not even trying to be subtle about it. Mr. Blaine grows impatient. Wolfe observed that too may work to our advantage. As the cleanup crew began dismantling the day's setup, Wolfe heaved himself to his feet. Archie, I would like you to speak with Miss Hayes privately before tomorrow's event. Arrange it. What should I tell her? Nothing substantive. I merely wish to gauge her understanding of the situation. Wolfe glanced around the room. Also ensure that Fritz secures anything of value in the kitchen. Tonight I suspect our Mr. Blaine may become more enterprising as his opportunity diminishes. That evening, I called Marion Hayes at her hotel and arranged to meet her for coffee at a small place 2 blocks from the Brownstone. She arrived looking tired, but alert. Her eyes Scanning the cafe with professional weariness, Mr. Goodwin, she said as she slid into the booth. I appreciate your reaching out, Miss Hayes. I understand there's some concern among the competitors. She gave a short laugh that's putting it mildly. This isn't real competition. It's something else entirely. What do you think it is? I asked, keeping my tone casual. She studied me for a moment. I think your employer already knows the answer to that. The question is whether he's part of it or not. Nero Wolfe doesn't partner with thieves, I said, flatly. Her shoulders relaxed slightly. Well, that's somewhat reassuring. Has he figured out what Blaine is really after? Mr. Wolfe prefers to assemble all the evidence before drawing conclusions. I replied, which was both true and non-committal. Well, tell him this, she said, leaning forward. Tomorrow's A Surprise challenge should be interesting. Anton has replaced his regular ingredients with substitutes that look identical, but would ruin any recipe. Eduardo has modified his techniques when cameras are near Sophia, and I have compared notes literally and discovered we've both been targeted how break-ins, mysterious inquiries from food journalists, sudden interest in our family recipes. She stirred her untouched coffee. We're not stupid, Mr. Goodwin. We've all heard the rumors about Blaine's methods. We just need to know if your boss is going to help stop him or if we're on our own. I gave her my most reassuring smile. Miss Hayes, I guarantee that Nero Wolfe never starts. Something he doesn't finish. Be ready for tomorrow. I think you'll find the final challenge quite revealing. Chapter 5. Hidden. Chapter 5. Hidden agendas. The final day of competition brought with it the kind of tension that makes the air feel too thick to breathe. Properly, I arrived in the dining room at 7:30 earlier than necessary to find Fritz already there, inspecting every corner of his kitchen with the focused attention of a diamond merchant. Check his inventory after a suspicious customer. All in order? I asked him. Fritz's mouth tightened. Someone has been here during the night. You're sure I know my kitchen? Mr. Goodwin, Fritz gestured to a barely perceptible scratch on one of the cabinet doors. This was not here when I left, and my arrangement of utensils has been disturbed. Anything missing? No. Fritz frowned. But my personal notebook, the one Mr. Wolfe had me lock in the safe, would have been if it had been left here. I made a mental note to check the security system. We had sensors on the windows and doors, and I'd set them myself before retiring. But someone with expertise could possibly bypass them. When I reported this to Wolfe during his breakfast, his only response was a contemplative indeed between bites of Fritz's incomparable omelette. His lack of surprise confirmed my suspicion that he'd anticipated something of the sort. Shall I call the police? I asked. Not yet, Wolfe replied. Let us allow the day's events to proceed as planned. You know that's not actually an answer. I pointed out. It is precisely an answer. Archie, just not to the question. You intended. Wolfe dabbed his lips with his napkin. Please ask Saul to join us at 6 this evening and Inspector Kramer at 7. That got my attention. Kramer was head of homicide at Manhattan West, and while he and Wolfe had a long-standing professional relationship, it wasn't one either man would characterize as warm. Bringing him in meant Wolfe was expecting something beyond the petty theft of recipes. By 10 guys and the competitors had arrived and were setting up their stations. The atmosphere was markedly different from previous days. Less competitive energy and more wary observation. The chefs exchanged glances that carried silent messages, and their assistants stayed closer than before, like bodyguards rather than helpers. Blaine arrived last. His media. Perfect smile firmly in place, but tension evident in the set of his shoulders. Veronica Watts trailed him, clipboard in hand as usual, her eyes darting around the room as if cataloging potential problems. Good morning, chefs. Blaine's voice carried the forced enthusiasm of a man trying too hard. Today's final challenge will be the most exciting yet. You've shown us your technical skills and creativity. Now it's time to reveal your secret weapons, your signature dishes. He paused for dramatic effects, canning the chefs' faces today. Each of you will prepare their recipe that defines your culinary identity, your most famous creation, the dish that made your reputation, and to add some spice to the competition, These recipes will be featured in a special cookbook commemorating this historic event. I watched the chef's reactions. Hayes's face tightened almost imperceptibly. His expression didn't change, but his hands stopped moving for a fraction of a second. Chen glanced at Gomez, who gave a barely noticeable shrug as an added bonus. Blaine continued, "I'll be observing more closely today to provide commentary for the documentation. I want to capture every nuance of your creative process." That announcement nearly made me smile. Wolfe had warned me this morning. To expect Blaine to become more aggressive in his information-gathering desperation often overcomes caution, it said as the chefs began preparing their stations. I noticed Wolfe studying them with the same intensity he usually reserved for crucial moments in murder investigations. His eyes missed nothing, particularly the careful way Hayes arranged her workspace to limit visibility of her preparation area. 30 minutes into the competition, Wolfe beckoned me over to the judges' table. "Archie, please check Miss Hayes' station. I believe there may be something of interest there." I circled around casually, pretending to adjust one of the lights. Hayes was working on what looked like a traditional pastry, her movements precise and economical. Nothing seemed out of ordinary, until I shifted angle and caught a glint of something metallic, partially hidden behind her ingredient tray, moving to a better position. I confirmed what Wolfe had somehow spotted from across the room. A tiny camera, larger than a button, positioned to capture Hayes's work surface. It was professionally placed, indistinguishable from equipment components to casual observation. I reported this to Wolfe, who nodded as if receiving expected confirmation. And the other stations, a more thorough circuit of the room, revealed similar devices at each chef station, all positioned to capture their techniques and recipes without their knowledge. All four, I told Wolfe, professional equipment. "Well hidden, satisfactory." Wolfe murmured, "Please continue your observations. Pay particular attention to Mr. Blaine's movements." Blaine was indeed circulating among the chefs, ostensibly making pleasant conversation, but clearly focusing on their techniques. He spent longest with Hayes, asking questions that required her to demonstrate specific methods. While Watts took notes nearby, his interest seemed more technical than culinary, focused on precise measurements and ingredient proportions rather than the art of cooking. When Blaine approached Chen's station, I positioned myself close enough to overhear their conversation. "That's a fascinating technique," Blaine said, watching Chen fold a delicate wrapper around her filling family tradition. 3 generations, Chen replied, her focus on her work. "My grandmother taught my mother, who taught me. Has it ever been documented for preservation of the tradition?" Chen's hands never faltered. "Some traditions aren't meant to be preserved on paper, Mr. Blaine. They're preserved through practice and teaching." Blaine's smile tightened slightly. "But surely in this modern age, with so many cooking shows and books, you'd want credit for your innovations. The only credit I need comes from those who enjoy my food," Chen said, effectively ending the conversation. When Blaine moved to Visa's station, the exchange was even briefer. Visa answered questions with minimal responses, his attention seemingly absorbed by his work, though. I noticed his eyes tracking Blaine's movements with cold precision. Gomez was more talkative, but equally guarded, describing his dish in general terms, while keeping specific techniques and measurements obscured by his body position. A strategy, I suspected, was deliberate. At the 2-hour mark, Wolfe called for a 15-minute break, an unexpected interruption that caused Blah to frown. The chefs stepped away from their stations, stretching and conferring quietly with their assistants. Mr. Goodwin, Wolfe said when approached the judges' table, "Would you be so kind as to retrieve the parcel Mr. Saul Panner delivered this morning? I believe it may be relevant to our proceedings." The parcel in question was a thick manila envelope that Saul had dropped off during Wolfe's breakfast. I hadn't been privy to its contents, but Wolfe's satisfied expression when he examined them suggested they were significant. When I returned with the envelope, Wolfe was engaged in conversation with the other judges, probably explaining the unexpected break. Blaine hovered nearby, his expression a mixture of irritation and forced politeness. Archie," Wolfe said, taking the envelope. "Thank you. Would you please inform our chefs that we will resume in 10 minutes, and perhaps you might check their stations for any adjustments that may have occurred during preparation." The hidden meaning was clear. When I made my circuit of the room, I discovered that the hidden cameras had been repositioned, angled for better views of the chef's final preparations. At Hayes Station, I found something new. A small wireless transmitter barely visible beneath her workbench, broadcasting the camera feed in real time before I could report this to Wolfe. I noticed Veronica Watts slipped from the dining room, moving with purpose toward Wolfe's office. I followed at a distance, watching. As she tried the door, found it locked, and Mauve moved onto Fritz's pantry. This time she entered, closing the door behind her. I gave her 30 seconds, then opened the door to find her photographing Fritz's handwritten labels on various containers lost again. I asked pleasantly, to her credit. She didn't startle or try to hide the camera research. She said smoothly, "Mr. Blaine wanted me to document the authentic environment of Mr. Wolfe's Brownstone. For the cookbook introduction, fascinating," I said, "especially since Mr. Blaine hasn't mentioned any specific cookbook featuring this. Brownstone and Fritz's pantry hardly qualifies as a public space. It's a surprise element," she said, slipping her camera into her pocket, part of the publishing plan. I'm sure I agreed. "Perhaps you'd like to return to the competition." I believe we're about to resume. As we walked back, I noticed her send a quick text message when we re-entered the dining room. Blaine's phone buzzed, and he checked it with a slight frown. The competition resumed with increased intensity. Each chef focused entirely on their signature creations. I reported the new findings to Wolfe, who listened without comment, but with the slight tightening around his eyes that told me pieces were falling into place for him. As the final minutes ticked down, I observed Blaine making one last circuit of the stations, his attention now almost predatory, as he watched the finishing touches being applied. To each dish, whatever game he was playing, it was reaching its conclusion. Judging proceeded with the usual formality, though I noticed Wolfe spent longer than necessary examining each creation, asking specific questions about techniques and ingredient ratios, questions that forced the chefs to reveal precisely the information Blaine seemed most interested in acquiring. When the tasting concluded, Wolfe remained at the judges' table rather than retiring for deliberation. His expression had that particular solidity it acquired when he'd reached a conclusion and was preparing to act on it before we announced today's results. He said, his voice cutting through the room's tension, "I believe we should address certain irregularities that have become apparent during this competition." Blaine's professional smile faltered. "Irregularities, Mr. Wolfe, indeed." Wolfe's fingers tapped once on the table. "Perhaps we might continue this discussion in my office. I believe there are matters best addressed in a more private setting." Blaine hesitated, then nodded, with forced casualness. "Of course, though. I'm not sure what irregularities you're referring to." "You will," Wolfe assured him. "You most certainly will." Chapter 6. The Final. Chapter 6. The Final Challenge. Wolfe's office had never seemed more like a courtroom than when we assembled there after the final cooking round. The four chefs stood in a loose semicircle, their competitive tensions temporarily suspended by mutual weariness. Blaine occupied the red leather chair with Veronica Watts standing behind him, clipboard still in hand. Though she wasn't writing anything, Wolfe sat behind his desk with the imperturbable calm of a judge who has already reached his verdict, but is obligated to hear final arguments. I took my usual chair, ready to observe and intervene if necessary. "Mr. Wolfe," Blaine began with forced casualness, "I'm not sure what irregularities you're referring to. The competition has proceeded exactly as planned." "Indeed," Wolfe replied, "precisely as you planned it, though not as you represented it to the participants." He shifted his bulk slightly. "Before we continue, I believe introductions are in order. While you all know each other professionally, I suspect there are aspects of your relationships that remain obscured." Blah's smile tightened. "We hardly need introductions at this stage. On the contrary," Wolfe said. "For instance, Miss Hayes may not be aware that you attempted to purchase her family's recipe collection through a third party last year using a shell company to disguise your involvement." Hayes's eyebrows rose. "That was you. The offer came from Heritage Culinary Acquisitions, a wholly owned subsidiary of Blaine Enterprises." Wolfe confirmed similarly. "Mr. Gomez might be interested to know that your real estate division purchased his building specifically to leverage his lease renewal." Gomez's expression darkened. The new landlord said the building changed hands for development purposes. A convenient fiction, Wolfe said. Mr. Visser, of course, is well aware of your animosity regarding his review of your first establishment, but perhaps not of your subsequent efforts to discredit him with several leading publications. This is absurd, Blaine protested, but his confident demeanor had begun to crack. You've assembled us here to make unfounded accusations, not unfounded, Wolfe countered, and certainly not my primary purpose. I merely wish to establish context for the true nature of this so-called competition. The chefs exchanged glances, and I noticed a subtle shift in their position. They had unconsciously formed a united front against Blaine, rather than remaining as separate competitors. Which is what exactly, Chen asked, her calm voice. Carrying a note of steel, Wolfe gestured to Archie. If you would be so kind as to explain what you discovered at Miss Hayes's station this morning. Hidden cameras, I said, watching Blaine for his reaction, professionally installed, positioned to capture detailed views of techniques and recipes. All 4 stations had them, that's standard documentary practice. Watts interjected quickly for the video record. An interesting assertion, Wolfe replied, particularly since these devices were not connected to your production equipment, but rather to a separate receiver. He turned to Blaine. A receiver found in your personal briefcase, Mr. Blaine. Blaine's face hardened. You searched my briefcase, that's completely inappropriate. Not I, Wolfe corrected Mr. Saul Panza, a licensed private investigator who observed you reviewing the footage in your hotel room last night, the same Mr. Panza, who obtained a partial manuscript of your forthcoming cookbook, which already contains recipes remarkably similar to those being prepared today. Credited to you, personally, the office fell silent. Hayes was the first to break it, so this whole competition was a setup to steal our recipes. Her voice was tight with controlled anger. Not just to steal them, Wolfe said, to document them in a way that would allow Mr. Blaine to claim they were his own creations with video evidence of his creative process should any legal challenges arise. Blaine stood abruptly. This is slander. I won't sither, and you will sit, Wolfe said with unexpected force, or I shall have Mr. Goodwin assist you in doing so. I shifted slightly, making it clear I was ready to enforce Wolfe's directive. Blaine hesitated, then slowly resumed his seat. The cameras are merely professional equipment, he said, his tone defensive, standard for any food documentation. Perhaps, Wolfe conceded, though less standard is breaking into a competitor's apartment to examine family recipe journals, or installing surveillance equipment in a private residence, or attempting to access a private pantry to photograph proprietary spice mixtures. You have no proof of any of that. What said speaking up for? The first time, on the contrary, Wolfe replied, we have M. Hayes's testimony regarding the break-in, Mr. Goodwin's direct observation of your photography activities, and security footage of an attempted entry to this Brownstone at 2:17 this morning. That last bit was news to me. Wolfe hadn't mentioned any security footage, but I kept my expression neutral. Knowing he occasionally embellished for strategic purposes, Visa stepped forward. I suspected something was wrong from the beginning. No legitimate competition changes its rules daily, or focuses so specifically on proprietary techniques. So this gathering, Blaine said, regaining some composure, is to what and even. If your accusations had merit, which they don't, what exactly are you proposing? I propose nothing. Wolfe replied, I merely present facts. What happens next depends largely on your cooperation. Cooperation with what? Blaine's voice had a brittle edge with correcting certain misapprehensions about ownership of intellectual property. Wolfe opened the manila envelope I had retrieved earlier, removing several documents I have here. The promotional materials for your cookbook, claiming credit for recipes, clearly developed by others. I also have evidence of systematic theft of culinary intellectual property from at least 7 professional chefs over the past 3 years. Recipes can't be copyrighted. Watts interjected, sounding like she was quoting legal advice. Culinary techniques are not protected intellectual property. True to a point, Wolfe acknowledged, though fraud, breaking and entering, corporate espionage, and violation of confidentiality agreements are all quite actionable. As Miss Hayes, Mr. Vissa, and M. Chen all required such agreements before agreeing to participate in this event, Blaine's face had gone pale. "What do you want?" Wolfe raised his eyebrows. "I want nothing beyond the satisfaction of a puzzle solved. These chefs, however, might have specific requirements to avoid, pursuing legal remedies for your actions." The four chefs exchanged glances again, some silent communication passing between them. Hayes spoke for the group full credit for our own recipes in any publication, a formal apology, and financial compensation for the abuse of our trust. Her tone made it clear these points weren't negotiable. Blackmail, Blaine muttered. Restitution, Wolfe corrected. And considerably less costly than the alternative, which is Wolfe checked his watch. Inspector Kramer of Homicide will be joining us shortly, while he may find insufficient grounds for criminal charges. The publicity surrounding a police investigation would surely interest both your invest and your publisher. The threat hung in the air. I watched Blaine calculate his options, the desperation gradually replaced by resignation. "Fine," he said. "Finally, I'll mend the cookbook credits and provide reasonable compensation. But this stays private, contingent upon complete cooperation." Wolfe stipulated. A knock at the door interrupted the negotiation. Fritz entered, his manner formal. "Sir, Inspector Kramer has arrived." "Excellent," Wolfe said. "Please show him in." Kramer entered like a bull. Finding a china shop had been set up specifically to annoy him. His bulky frame and perpetual scowl were as familiar as his habit of chewing an unlit cigar, which he was doing now with particular vigor. "Wolfe," he growled by way of greeting. "What's so urgent that I need to come here personally on a Friday evening, a matter requiring your expertise?" Wolfe replied smoothly, "Though I believe we may have reached a preliminary understanding that might simplify your involvement." Kramer's suspicious gaze swept the room, taking in the assembled chefs, Blaine's tense posture, and the documents spread on Wolfe's desk. "What kind of understanding?" he asked clearly, sensing he was entering a scene already in progress. Mr. Blaine was just agreeing to certain terms regarding intellectual property rights and compensation for attempted appropriation of proprietary culinary creations. Wolfe explained. "Was he?" Kramer looked at Blaine with renewed interest. "Voluntary agreement? Or did you squeeze him into it?" "Purely voluntary," Wolfe assured him, though perhaps accelerated by awareness of potential legal consequences. Kramer grunted. "And you need me here?" "Why, to witness the agreement should Mr. Blaine reconsider. After leaving these premises and to assess whether certain actions specifically breaking and entering corporate espionage and fraud warrant official investigation." Blaine stood suddenly. "I've agreed to the terms. There's no need for police involvement. Sit down," Kramer ordered with the automatic authority of decades in law enforcement. Surprisingly, Blaine complied. "Now someone explain exactly what's been going on here and don't leave anything out." Wolfe nodded to me. "Archie, if you would summarize the situation." For the inspector, as I began recounting the events of the past 3 days, I watched Blaine's face cycle through frustration, calculation, and finally resignation. Whatever scheme he had concocted, it was coming apart completely, and we hadn't even gotten to the part about the hidden cameras. Yet Wolfe settled back in his chair, with the satisfied expression of a chess player who had foreseen every move of the game, and was now simply waiting for the inevitable checkmate. The final challenge, it seemed, wasn't for the chefsat. All it was for Blaine himself. Chapter 7 Gathering in the office. By the time I finished summarizing the events of the past 3 days for Inspector Kramer, the atmosphere in Wolfe's office had thickened to the consistency of cold gravy. Kramer sat in the yellow chair that had been brought in for him, chewing his unlit cigar with the focused intensity of a man trying to decide between anger and professional interest. Blaine had settled into a rigid posture, his Meador-trained smile long gone, while Veronica Watts stood behind him, her clipboard now closed and clutched to her chest like armor. The 4 chefs had arranged themselves along the bookshelves, no longer competitors but witnesses to whatever. Justice Wolfe was orchestrating. Fritz had brought beer for Wolfe and whiskey for Kramer, without being asked, a testament to his understanding of the situation. Gravity, so Kramer said, when I concluded removing the mangled from his mouth. "You're telling me this whole cooking contest was a front for industrial espionage, not industrial," Wolfe corrected. culinary. Though the principles are identical, and you knew this from the beginning, Kramer directed this at Wolfe with his usual mix of suspicion and grudging. Respect, I suspected, Wolfe replied. Mr. Blaine's reputation preceded him, and the circumstances of his proposal were. Suggestive, Kramer repeated flatly. So instead of reporting suspected criminal activity, you set up your own sting operation. I merely accepted a business proposition and observed the results, Wolfe said. Had I alerted authorities prematurely, nothing could have been proven. Kramer grunted in reluctant acknowledgement of this logic. He turned to Blaine. And what do you have to say about these allegations? For a moment I thought Blaine might continue denying everything, but the evidence was too substantial. His shoulders sagged slightly. It was a legitimate competition. He insisted, though, with less conviction than before, the documentation was standard practice for any culinary event. The hidden cameras, I asked, the break-in at Miss Hayes' apartment, the unauthorized entry to this Brownstone. I had nothing to do with any break-in, Blaine said, quickly, then glanced at Watts, who remained impassively silent. Kramer caught the look. Is that right, Miss Watts? You acted independently. She straightened her spine. I have no comment without legal representation convenient, Kramer muttered, then addressed the chefs. Any of you want to file formal charges? There was a moment of silent communication among them before Hayes spoke. We're interested in a resolution that protects our intellectual property rights. Criminal charges would be complicated. For our professional reputations, always the way Kramer sighed. Everyone wants justice until it comes with publicity. He turned back to Wolfe. So, why am I here exactly? Sounds like they're working toward a private SCM because Mr. Kramer. Wolfe said there is a difference between what can be proven in court and what actually occurred. I believe these chefs deserve to know the full extent of Mr. Blaine's operation before deciding on appropriate restitution. Wolfe reached for the document on his desk, the manuscript Saul had obtained, and opened it to a marked page. This purports to be Mr. Blaine's forthcoming cookbook, featuring what he calls a signature recipes developed over decades of culinary exploration. Yeah, there we have. He turned to a specific page. Miss Chen's distinctive dim sum preparation dated 6 months ago, credited entirely to Mr. Blaine. Chen's eyes widened. That's impossible. I've never published that recipe. Indeed not, Wolfe agreed. Yet here it is, with only minor modifications. Precisely the modifications you made today. During the competition, he couldn't have included today's version in a manuscript from 6 months ago. Visser objected, his logical mind catching the inconsistency. An excellent observation, Wolfe said, which suggests Firk's eyes narrowed. That this competition was merely confirmation. He already had our recipes from another source. Precisely, Wolfe turned to Blaine. You have been systematically infiltrating restaurants and private kitchens for years, placing staff who report back with recipes and techniques. This competition was meant to provide video documentation that would help defend against any future plagiarism claims, visual proof that these were your creations. Blaine's face had gone from pale to flushed. You can't prove any of that. Mr. Saul Panzer has interviewed 3 former employees who served as your informants, Wolfe replied calmly. Their testimonials are quite detailed. Hayes stepped forward. So all those employment applications we received from inexperienced but eager staff were plants. I confirmed, according to Saul's sources at least. Gomez muttered something in Spanish that sounded distinctly uncomplimentary. He sent someone to my restaurant. Last year, young man said he wanted to learn authentic techniques, worked for 3 months, then disappeared. Miguel Fuentes, Wolfe supplied, currently employed as a culinary consultant for Blaine Enterprises. The revelation hit the chefs like a physical blow. This wasn't just about today's competition. It was about years of systematic theft. That's why you wanted my family's recipe journals. Hayes set her voice tight with anger. You couldn't infiltrate my development process because I test recipes in my home kitchen, and why my restaurant lease suddenly became an issue. Gomez added pressure to share recipes or lose my location. Kramer had been listening with growing interest. This sounds less like a civil dispute and more like a pattern of criminal behavior. He fixed his gaze on Blaine, breaking and entering corporate espionage, fraud, harassment. That's just what I'm hearing in this room, allegations, Blaine said, But his confidence was crumbling unproven allegations at the moment. Wolfe agreed, though. Mr. Panza has compiled quite an extensive dossier, which Inspector Kramer would no doubt find fascinating reading. I watched Blaine calculating his options, which were diminishing by the second. When he spoke again, his voice had a desperate edge. What exactly do you want? Wolfe raised his eyebrows. Nothing. This matter concerns these chefs whose work you have appropriated. Hayes stepped forward again, assuming the role of spokesperson. Complete withdrawal of your cookbook written acknowledgement. The recipes you've already published belonging to any of us were obtained unethically. Financial compensation for damages, and a binding agreement never to use any of our recipes or techniques in any form that would bankrupt me. Blaine protested too. Of my restaurants feature these dishes as signature items. Perhaps you should have considered that before stealing them, Visser said coldly. Perhaps, Wolfe interjected. In a compromise might be reached. The recipes could remain in your restaurants with proper credit and a licensing fee paid to their creators. The chefs exchanged glances again. Chen nodded slightly. That would be acceptable, Hayes said, with appropriate terms and transparency. Kramer, who had been following this negotiation with surprising patience, cleared his throat. All very neat. But there's still the matter of breaking and entering, which isn't something that can be settled privately, if there's evidence indeed. Wolfe agreed, though perhaps given the complexity of proving specific involvement and the willingness of these chefs to accept appropriate restitution, law enforcement resources might be better directed elsewhere. It was a delicate suggestion, not asking Kramer to ignore criminal behavior, but to consider the practical aspects of a difficult prosecution for what might be deemed a minor crime in the grand scheme of things. Kramer chewed his cigar thoughtfully. I'd need detailed statements from everyone involved, and any agreement would need to include stipulations about future behavior. Naturally, Wolfe said. I watched the tension drain from Blaine's shoulders as he realized he might escape criminal charges, replaced by the grim resignation of a man facing substantial financial penalties, but not actual jail time. Fine, he said. I'll agree to credit and licensing arrangements and withdraw the cookbook in its current form. Watts finally spoke up. Blaine, I strongly advise against making any agreements without legal counsel present. I think we're past that point, Veronica Blaine replied wearily. The alternative seems to be Inspector Kramer taking a very close look at our business practices. Kramer nodded. Very close with search warrants. Then we have the outline of an agreement. Wolfe said the details can be formalized through appropriate legal channels tomorrow. For now, perhaps it would be beneficial for Mr. Blaine to provide Inspector Kramer with a preliminary statement regarding the events we've discussed. It was neatly done. Wolfe had maneuvered the situation to give the chefs the leverage they needed without explicitly asking Kramer to compromise his official duties. Blaine would face consequences without a public scandal that might damage the chefs' reputations by association. As Kramer began taking blah statement, Fritz appeared at the door. Dinner will be ready in 30 minutes, sir, he announced to Wolfe. Thank you, Fritz. Wolfe replied. Please set places for our chef guests as well. I believe this occasion warrants a proper meal. As Fritz withdrew, Hayes approached Wolfe's desk. Mr. Wolfe, thank you for what you've done, but I'm curious, why did you agree to host this competition in the first place? You must have suspected what was happening. Wolfe's lips twitched in what might have been the ghost of a smile. In my experience, Miss Hayes, the best way to understand a puzzle is to observe it in operation, and sometimes the best way to prevent a crime is to allow it to begin under controlled conditions so that it can be definitively stopped. And the fee he paid you, Visser asked, bluntly, will be donated to a culinary education fund. Wolfe replied. Less expenses. Of course, I hid my smile. Trust Wolfe to maintain his principles while still ensuring the Brownstone finances remained intact. Some things never changed, even when our dining room was temporarily converted into a battlefield of culinary espionage. The matter wasn't fully resolved yet, but the path forward was clear. As Fritz would say, the ingredients were assembled, and the recipe for justice was well. Chapter 8. The Recipe Thief underway. Chapter 8. The recipe thief dinner that evening was one of the more remarkable meals I've witnessed in the Brownstone, and that's saying something with Blaine and Watts parted Blaine to consult. With his lawyer Watts to presumably update her resume, the four chefs had taken over our kitchen with Fritz's blessing. What followed was a kind of culinary jam session with these masters of their craft collaborating, rather than competing for the first time. Kramer had left shortly after taking Blaine's statement, muttering about paperwork and the headaches Wolfe invariably caused him. He declined the dinner invitation with the gruff acknowledgement that he preferred to maintain some professional distance from what had essentially been an unauthorized sting operation, even if it had produced legitimate results. Now seated at the dining table with Wolfe, this customary position at the head, I watched as course after impeccable course emerged. From the kitchen, Hayshad prepared an appetizer that made Wolfe close his eyes in appreciation. For a full 10 seconds, Visa followed with a soup that prompted a rare excellent from the great man. Chen and Gomez collaborated on the main courses, and the entire meal was accompanied by wines that Wolfe had selected from his cellar with unusual generosity. Fritz, rather than being territorial about his kitchen, moved among the visiting chefs with professional respect, occasionally exchanging technical observations or approving nods. It was like watching a summit meeting of culinary diplomats, Mr. Wolfe Hayes said as we enjoyed the dessert she had created. You never fully explained how you knew what Blaine was, planning you anticipated his moves before. He made them. Wolfe dabbed his lips with his napkin. The pattern was evident from the initial proposal. The excessive fee offered for the use of these premises immediately suggested ulterior motives. Suspicion isn't the same as knowledge, Visser pointed out. True, Wolfe acknowledged, but research quickly revealed Mr. Blaine's history of appropriating others' culinary creations. Additionally, his selection of participants was revealing. Each of you represented something he desired, but could not legitimately obtain. My family recipes, Hayes said. My techniques. Chen added. My restaurant location. Gomez contrib. Ed and my reputation, which he tried to destroy when he couldn't buy it, Visa concluded. Precisely, Wolfe agreed. The pattern suggested not just opportunistic theft, but a systematic campaign. But how did you know about the hidden cameras? Chen asked. Those weren't installed until the competition began. I didn't know specifically, Wolfe admitted, but some form of documentation was necessary for his scheme to succeed. Merely having the recipes would be insufficient if challenged. He needed proof he could claim, showed the development process. The cameras were the logical method. You set a trap. Gomez set his tone, suggesting admiration. Using your own home as beta-controlled environment, Wolfe corrected, where Mr. Blaine's activities could be observed and documented without risk to your legitimate intellectual property. Hayes smiled slightly. Is that why you had us prepare those specific dishes today? To confirm they matched what was already in his manuscript, among other reasons, Wolfe acknowledged. The timing was instructive. The manuscript was dated months ago, yet contained preparations identical to those you demonstrated today, a temporal impossibility, unless he had obtained them previously through other means. So the competition was nothing but theater. Vis set a way to create evidence that these were his recipes, and to acquire additional techniques, Wolfe added, including some of Fritz's methods, which explains Miss Watts's particular interest in our kitchen. Fritz, who had joined us for coffee, nodded grimly. My arrangement of spices would mean nothing to an ordinary observer, but someone seeking to replicate techniques, it would be a valuable insight. Jen finished for him. Professional kitchens have their own language, indeed. Wolfe agreed, a language Mr. Blaine sought to appropriate without the years of discipline required to develop it naturally. There's one thing I still don't understand, I said, because there always is. How did Blaine get access to recipes from chefs who never worked with him directly? Hayes develops recipes at home and Chen never accepted his job offer. Wolfe's lips twitched slightly. Mr. Panza's investigation revealed that Blaine employs a network of what might be called culinary spies staff, placed in target restaurants specifically to learn and report back proprietary methods. The young man who worked for Mr. Gomez before disappearing suddenly was one such operative. Gomez's expression darkened. Miguel. I taught him my grandmother's techniques that subsequently appeared in Blaine's Miami restaurant. Wolfe confirmed similarly. Miss Hayes received several inquiries from food journalists seeking to document her family recipes for historical preservation. Those weren't real journalists, Hayes said with sudden understanding. Just blames people gathering information correct. And Miss Chen was repeatedly approached by equipment suppliers offering to test her kitchen setup, providing opportunities to observe her methods. Chen shook her head. I declined them all. I'm naturally suspicious, which is likely why Mr. Blaine took such interest in your notebook during today's competition. Wolfe said you represented his most significant remaining gap. And now Visor asked what happens to Blaine. He will honor the agreement negotiated today. Wolfe said with certainty, the alternative Inspector Kramer's continued interest in his business practices is considerably less appealing. Will it stop him permanently? Hayes wondered that Wolfe admitted I cannot guarantee, but his methods have been exposed. His reputation damaged among those whose opinions matter most in his field, and his legal exposure made painfully clear self-interest, if not ethics, should guide his future behavior. The chefs exchanged glances, seemingly satisfied with this assessment. The conversation shifted to more general culinary topics, with Wolfe demonstrating his encyclopedic knowledge of food history, and Fritz occasionally contributing insights from his decades of experience. As the evening concluded, the four chefs presented Wolfe with a jointly prepared dish, a creation they had developed together in our kitchen, combining elements of each of their signature styles. Mr. Wolfe Hayes said, "Formally, we've created this as a token of appreciation. It has no name yet. No written recipe exists. It exists only in this moment and in our shared experience." Wolfe regarded the dish with genuine interest. A fitting conclusion. Some creations are meant to be experienced rather than documented after the chefs had departed. With promises of future collaborations and invitations to their respective establishments, Wolfe and I returned to the office. He settled into his chair with a sigh of satisfaction that encompassed both the meal and the case's resolution. A productive endeavor, had declared, reaching for the book he'd set aside days earlier. Productive, I agreed, taking my seat at my desk, though I can't help wondering if you accepted Land's proposal, primarily because you were curious about those chefs' techniques yourself. Wolfe's expression didn't change, but there was a telltale pause before he opened his book, Culinary Knowledge. Archie, like all knowledge, has intrinsic value, independent of its immediate application, which doesn't actually answer my question, I pointed out, Fritz Wolfe said. Ignoring my observation as informed method, he found the collaboration most educational. I believe several of our future meals may reflect certain refinements. As a result, so you did get recipes out of this after all, I said, just not the way Blaine intended. There is a fundamental difference. Wolfe replied with dignity between appreciation that acknowledges its sources and appropriation that denies them, a difference about as substantial as the fee you collected. And noted, which as promised will be donated to culinary education, less expenses. He turned a page, a most satisfactory conclusion. I couldn't disagree. Blaine's scheme had been exposed. The chefs had received justice, and our dining prospects for the foreseeable future had been considerably enhanced. If that also happened to align with Wolfe's gastronomic interests, well, that was just the kind of elegant efficiency that made his method so effective. As Fritz had wisely observed during the case in the culinary world, a chef's recipes are their legacy. Some things should never be for sale, but they can, under the right circumstances, be generously shared. The difference, as Wolfe might say, was a matter of both ethics and aesthetics, and on both counts justice had been impeccably served. And so Wolfe and Archie solve another case, proving that justice can be served alongside a perfect soul. I hope you enjoyed this story.